The good news is I received at least 10 questions. And most questions concentrate on chapter 2 or 3. There are very few suggestions for chapter 1. But I don't want to limit your intervention to the written remarks, but I will give priority to the written remarks before I give the floor to the rest of the audience, of course. So if you agree with the procedure this morning, we should continue with the 2 other questions, and then I'll open the floor to everyone. Of course, we will be short of time. That was already predictable, but now it's clear. And I understand that some of you will have arrangements for travel, but Guido Razi has kindly accepted that we may overstep by half an hour if that was necessary, but not more. Okay. Before continuing discussion, I would like to ask Noel if in the discussion this morning there was any point for clarification so that we don't embark on a false discussion this afternoon.
That may be a difficult question to answer, but I think perhaps to explain one particular aspect which relates to the expert witness, because it has been mentioned a number of times. So try to explain it in the most lay language as possible. According to our system, we do not have any problem to invite any opinion leader to the work of the agency, be it at the level of the scientific committees, the working parties, or the advisory groups. There is one condition. We cannot invite any expert which is working at the level of pharmaceutical industry. So that's the only condition. We introduced another element to it, which was no current financial interest. So anyone who is at the level of our committees or working parties can have no current financial interest. And financial interest has been widely debated at the level of the management board. It relates both to the holding of shares of a pharmaceutical company and compensation fees, honoraria, salaries paid directly by a company to the individual, other than payment for expenses incurred with research work or reimbursement of reasonable expenses in relation to conference and seminar attendance. An expert witness can have financial interest in pharmaceutical industry, so can be paid for whatever work that is being done other than research work, can have financial shares in pharmaceutical industry, but nevertheless can still come the level of the committee or at the level of the scientific advisory groups, etc., to be heard and to reply to any particular questions. So I would like to clarify that there is this concept. It may not have been used to the extent that we all thought it was going to be used, and there may be other reasons why expert witnesses have not been used at the level of the committees and the advisory groups, but it has nothing to do with the level of conflict of interest.
Okay, thank you for that. Now, as I announced this morning, I would like to switch to the second question. And if Richard had to leave, maybe you could just help us and start with your reaction, and then I go through the rest of the panel. I'd like to add one element, since Richard was very frustrated of not being a member of the management board, since he is risk 4 or 5 or something like that. I would say that, in fact, for me, industry has the same interest globally as everybody else, because a conflict of interest could introduce a bias in favor of a competitor. And this is, for industry, even more important than for us. So, I mean, we are on the same boat here, I suppose. Richard.
I hate to complicate matters, but I think as some of the previous panelists alluded to, it's not just about if you've been involved with a company in question. Was it that program? Was it another program you're involved in? So the timelines may actually have to be flexible, which of course provides even less of predictability. I know I'm complicating matters, but just to illustrate that with the length of drug development timelines, in fact, you may have been involved intimately with a research program which was 7-8 years ago, which is now actually in front of you. Now, I think that in most cases or all cases, people are going to realize that they have to recuse themselves and say, I can't be part of this, because even if I technically are okay with these timelines, I actually know about this program because I was advising the company 7 years ago. So I say that as an acknowledgement. In general, though, I think that the basic timelines of 5 years is probably too long. I think we also need here to look at what the FDA has done recently in acknowledgement of their tremendous problems in recruiting members to advisory committees. It used to be very easy. It was competition to be on the advisory committees, but because of the strengthening that they did some 6-7 years ago, which they now had to go back on, there are shorter timelines than 5 years. So I think that there should be shorter timelines, but an acknowledgement that you actually have to have a bit of active monitoring and actually extend that timeline for certain types of cases. You may have been giving advice 10 years ago, which produces a bias, because maybe the whole medicine is developed because what you said 10 years ago. And then you are that father of it and should probably not be part of the decision making.
Okay, thank you. I start with Serge on this side. Okay, Pierre, you have made a clear statement that, in fact, conflict of interest should be totally abolished from the scene. But nevertheless, there may be, there may be cases where you could think that within the existing system, improvement could be made.
Yeah. In fact, I'm just referring to own principles of the agency. If I take the document conflict of interest at a glance, page 3, and in the corner at the right side, it said that the risk level 1 is full unrestricted involvement, and it corresponds to no interest over 5 years. So if the agency applies that, in this table, which is taken from the evaluation of conflicts of interest form, there should be no green box at all. So for me, it's a contradiction.
Well, maybe I'll leave it to you to reflect on that, and I'll come back to you at the end of the panel too, huh? just to clarify this issue. Rory?
Thank you. Well, I'm relieved that even Pierre believes that everyone deserves a second chance and you can be reborn. To me, this whole issue of 2 years and 5 years is completely and utterly arbitrary. You're just picking this figure out of the air and saying, you're contagious for 5 years, but after 5 years, the infection is gone, and now you're clean somehow. You begin to do these products. And for me, it goes back to a problem that Anya identified before as well. I don't think that necessarily there should be a period of time applied, but I think that on a case-by-case basis, you look and you see, do you have any conflict in this agenda point or this product? And if you do, you're out of the equation. If not, you should be absolutely valid to be a part of the actual procedure. But as Anya pointed out, sometimes when I attend a meeting, I'm told that Rory is risk level 3, but we've done an analysis and we've decided that he can have full participation. And I really have no idea how that actually happened. I'm glad to hear it, right? But it would be better if it was more transparent to say, here's the actual decision tree we went along, and this is where we decide. But does anybody honestly think that after 1 year, kind of 11 months and 3 weeks, I'm a problem, and suddenly a week later, I'm not a problem? It just doesn't make any sense to me.
Okay, so no more generic quarantine. We should distinguish between pest and cholera.
It's like with dogs. You either put them down or you let them out, okay?
Okay, Martin?
Yes, indeed. Those remarks go a bit in the same direction as one point I was making this morning, is that excessive complication in the rules opens up the room for arbitrary decisions. So I think clearer and simpler rules actually would help everybody's life, both the scientists and both the officials. So about this 2 to 5 years, I agree. It's very arbitrary as a decision, and you have to be a bit more specific. Perhaps looking at the distinction between financial and intellectual conflicts of interest might be of help for that. For instance, well, in my organization, we have a campaign at the EU level tackling what we call revolving door phenomenon. So this switches between the public and the private sector, in which we are asking for any EU official who has worked on a given policy subject for the Commission, let's say, cannot go to a job in the private sector that would constitute a conflict of interest for 3 years. Why is that? Is because the privileged information and the privileged access to decision makers he has during the 3 years will have gone public after 3 years. And this figure 3 years actually comes from the US system, where they have done some econometric measurements, because they love that, to assess the market value of a parliamentary assistant. And the economic value of his privileged connection was equaled 0 after 3 years, because it was no longer a privileged connection. It was just a connection anybody using Google could have. So this is not out of thin air. You know, this comes out of something. So I think you have to look, for instance, in the case of a financial conflict of interest. Well, in the pharma industry, which I don't know very well, the product cycles are very long on day. So probably you need to have a very long period that matches this. On the other hand, as far as intellectual conflicts of interest go, I'm not sure, it also boils down to this notion of independence. Independence in absolute terms is meaningless unless you're dead. Relatively, on the other hand, it means something. So in the case of EMA, I think what is really paramount, in case it wasn't clear already, is independent from industry. But for the rest, I mean, okay, if you belong to a fanatic religious group and you have to deal about stem cell research, then probably your intellectual conflicts of interest is a real problem. But that's a minority. So probably, I think the category of intellectual conflicts of interest should or could be only restricted to chairs and vice chairs, because those people have a neutrality duty in organizing the discussion around their colleagues. But for the rest, I think what could be better than looking for pure monks somewhere in the atmosphere is to strive for the maximum diversity of academic backgrounds and opinions.
Okay, thank you. Nikos?
Well, I think that we should achieve the goal to adhere to the spirit of what we have put down. And indeed, whenever we find the letter to be arbitrary, to change it. So I think that for all those cases where we hear that these numbers or we have left out something, whenever we collect this, and since we have this process of constant review, to actually substitute the figures or the taxonomy and the typology with the real issues. I mean, I was talking with Anya at the break that instead of having a husband, perhaps you should have a boyfriend, or in some countries where civil union between men is not recognized, probably you can get away with it. But she corrected me and said it's the household. So whoever is there would count. So these things we have to really be able to identify what really could constitute a potential conflict of interest, and then amend, of course. I also would like to add, in the case of the patient groups, it was in your review slides. One of the things that we make very clear in our engagement with all stakeholders is that delivery of health is not just one thing. So the government affairs, the health policy, preventive medicine. All of these things are very important. So, well, companies, in response to that, they sometimes organize advisory meetings on prevention, or on, on access and people who are excluded. These are not product-specific types of meetings, but unfortunately, instead of having the state or the commission facilitating these things, you have the industry, as indeed the industry is responsible for the continuous medical education, which is another ridiculous thing which we have allowed collectively. But we must not have any hypocrisy about it. Recognize that it happens, and not make this an exclusion criteria. So again, in the case of patients, I think that it should be very clear that there are types of engagement with a funder which does not constitute. People must go into the heart of the content.
Thank you. Maybe, Noel, has the question been clarified, the one which Pierre has raised?
Yes. So what it means is the following. Interests need to be declared up to 5 years. Beyond 5 years, it does not. There's no conflict of interest considered. You can always, because of transparency reasons, declare it. And we have had cases in the past where members of the committee, even after 10 years, said, I still have a conflict of interest and I don't want to participate in the discussions at the level of the committee. However, that is up to each member to take that particular decision. Indeed, in the at a glance document, we've tried to summarize in a very lay language. So you have situations where you can have full involvement with 4 or 5 years. So for instance, if I take one example, when you have an indirect interest, such as investigator within between 2 and 5 years at the level of a working party, for instance, there are no restrictions. So you can have full involvement. So you always have to look at it in a way that you have the conflict of you have an interest which you have declared, the duration during which this interest has occurred, and the type of activity you're going to happen. Here, we also have taken a very risk-proportionate approach, which is decision-making bodies tougher than advisory bodies, rapporteurs tougher than other members, etc. So, but these 3 elements always need to be looked at together, not in isolation.
Okay, Daniel.
Maybe I'm a little puzzled by the discussion focusing on the expert himself or herself. I think we have also to put things in context about the safeguards. To me, the safeguards are the scientific committees themselves. What are the experts there for? We are asking them 1, 2, or 3 very sharp questions they have to answer about, and they are not sitting in front of specialists in airplane security. All the members of the scientific committee have the same background as a scientific education. As soon as you have something that, an outlier opinion, we all have a critical view whether or not this is plausible or not. We are asking questions in order to clarify. Don't believe that the one expert is the decision maker. He's not driving the full decision. Experts might not be followed at all, and so on. So I think we have to look at that in context and not be obsessed by, who is in front of us.
Yeah, that's a point I wanted to raise in my next slide. The dynamics of peer review and how the peer review processes or the organizational aspects can still minimize or neutralize the conflict. Anja?
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, as a chair, I would appreciate a simpler system, because sometimes you have to keep track of that this person can participate in discussion but cannot vote. This person cannot be rapporteur. This person are not allowed to say anything in this discussion like that. It's not a big problem in the committee I have, but it could be if we continue this way. I think. For the committees and also for the working parties, maybe, I think a 2-year cutoff level for contacts with industry or employment by industry is fine, and there's no need to go further than that. However, as was said before, if you've been involved in the development of this particular product, I think you should be out forever. You are not. You should not be allowed to be part of that, because you will have a bias as being this is my product, this is good, this is whatever, I want this to succeed, whether it should succeed or not. So that is the thing. I think it's very human. I don't think any of us can actually say that we are not influenced by that. For the experts in the scientific advisory groups, the external expert, I think, and I plead for we get more flexibility in looking at specifically what is their involvement, and is there any chance or risk that this involvement will have any influence in what they say in front of specific questions from this. So I plead for more flexibility for these. And then with this, you have flexibility for niche sectors. I think even if the veterinary part is only 10% of the whole turnover here, I don't think the veterinary sector should be a niche sector, but there are areas inside the veterinary sector that are niches, and those need specific attendance.
So you suggest that we have red, yellow, and green badges. The green ones are risk zero, and so on. So that in the room you could recognize who can take the floor. Okay, Wolf-Dieter.
Yes, 3 points. First of all, I think intellectual conflicts of interest should be reported, and the chair of the committee or the advisory group or whatever should decide whether this is relevant to the topic discussed. We all know that intellectual conflict of interest exists. If you are an editor of an independent drug bulletin, you have a conflict of interest, but probably this is not relevant to the decision made within the committee. Second point, I think also, as also already said during my presentation, if you are sitting in the advisory board of a health insurance, this should be, of course, reported to the EMA, but also probably this will not have any consequences. First point. Second point, as a clinician, I would like to remind you that at the moment, I think this is not only in Germany, but all over Europe, if you are chairman of a department at a hospital, you need an infrastructure to perform your clinical trials. Of course, you would be happy if it is possible to finance this infrastructure only by investigator-initiated trials. I was heavily involved in leukemia research. I got about 200 euro per patient, but I was not able, based on these clinical trials, to do anything regarding the infrastructure. And in Germany, we do not receive money from the hospital, from the university, or any other independent funding. Therefore, we are really also dependent to perform at least a small percentage of clinical trials sponsored by the industry. Of course, we decide whether they make sense, whether the goal or the objective makes sense, but nevertheless, this is necessary. And therefore, I think this has to be also included a little bit in your deliberations. Regarding the threshold 2 or 5 years, for me, is ridiculous. Why? For example, if I perform in a clinical trial with a long follow-up in oncology, which is good because we want to get the safety signals after 3, 4, 5, 6 years, then I have a conflict of interest for 5, 6 years in a clinical trial of good quality. If I participate in a clinical trial that stops follow-up after 2 years, which is bad, my conflict of interest will stop after 2 years. Therefore, I would really think about these 2 or 5 years. It makes no sense, and I would also vote for a more flexible decision regarding these 2 or 5 years. Otherwise, I think it's not good. Thank you.
Okay, so clearly the question about the timing and the precise judgment rather than a just sort of overall attitude. I fully agree with you when you say also about this other conflicts which should be declared and do not prevent you from participating. People have to know where you come from. I mean, it's clear. And more there is a cooperation between the agency and the health technology assessment network and so on. So these are important considerations which have to be included now. The witness expert concept has been clarified, and it's seen as one way forward. and generally speaking, this is encouraged. On this question of the patient nomination by the Commission, and what about their own possible personal conflict or conflict because their organization are subsidized. Bob, would you like to say something? I left it for later, but since it's just now coming up.
Well, Fernand, thank you for giving me this question, but I'm not, let's say, don't have that much expertise in this area, so I would prefer that we reply to that in writing. This being said, I'm certainly willing to answer your other question.
Okay, but we'll come back to that. Huh? But this was rather specific, and the Commission, as a nominating authority, should also probably provide the agency with their own advice on how to handle that. Now, if I may turn to the everything else. My everything else list is very short compared to what Pierre and Martin has said, which opened the discussion to much broader horizons. And we have to respect that this is a general discussion which is going on. And even the agency has to listen to that discussion and see what could be taken on board. Huh? But my questions were much more concretely linked to the present situation. My first point, as I said already, reputation, integrity, gratitude, values. It's very difficult to express it in a guideline or in a policy document, but I feel that it's nevertheless important. And whether you thank experts in a personal letter or in a conference or in other ways, it has to be looked at, and recognizing that it's a real job. People do sacrifices, people are proud, but it has to be known outside. Huh? But everybody would agree with that. Huh? And it's the same question for independent direct bulletins or associations. Anya has expressly mentioned the difficulty of the procedure, but it has been mentioned also by other quarters. So it is clear that even for myself, when I tried to prepare the conference before, I got the excellent notes from Noel. Having to fish on the internet, the policy on the one hand, the breach of trust on the other hand, and other element of transparency, very difficult to put that together. And experts have not so much time, so that when they don't understand the policy, they feel they are the victim of a bureaucratic system. But since the agency envisaged to make a publication after this meeting as a follow-up, I would advise that the publication is not only about procedures, but tells the story a little bit. Recognizes the value of experts. I mean, find some words about value and beyond the sort of procedural aspects. Now, my third point, I believe very firmly from observing the creation of the agency, the committees which existed before, the ones I had to manage when I was Director of Public Health at the European Commission, SANCO, I think there is something to be said about the dynamics. The dynamics of peer review are very powerful to fight against individual biases. It's true for the divergence of scientific opinion which may exist, but also the sort of, as we heard, most people will not be influenced. It would be in good faith when they, but they could be influenced without knowing it. We've heard that because of the capture which may exist. So I think the best defense is transparency on the one hand, minutes being published. The EPA was a big step, even imperfect at the very beginning, but a big step because nobody wanted us, not even the Commission, to publish the evaluation before the decision was taken. And we thought that having put that on the internet at that time, which was the first years of the internet, allowed people from outside the box to make extra comments. And we had even a court case at the European Court of a lady, a professor from Canada, who challenged one decision. So, I mean, transparency comes as part of that process. And my question on top of that is, thinking aloud, would be, in some very specific instances, although that's not the practice in Europe, could public hearings be envisaged to reinforce the peer review element? I mean, bringing in the outside knowledge as well as the inside knowledge. But it's a question, an open question. And my next point is, now that we have everything on the net, who would be the best whistleblowers? I mean, it's left to the democratic system. It's left to everybody. I remember that in Sanko we had one case when we created an independent experts committee on environment and health, independent experts of a very famous professor, which we found out was in fact working secretly for the tobacco industry. And of course, we couldn't find out ourselves. I mean, it was because of elements which we found, and we had to take very drastic measures. But I mean, if you have so many experts, it's prone to happen one day or the other, and you have to have to be prepared to that. So who are going to be the whistleblowers, the best whistleblowers? I will ask you the question. And my other point is, if there is a breach of trust, should EMEA, having gone through all the scrutiny procedure and hearings which for defense rights, at the end, if there is a real breach of trust, should they name and shame, so that would be the first sanction in case of breach? I personally think that should be done. And we have also on the table this new initiative, which is a massive new step taken by industry. Of course, it's the industry would prefer to do it itself than being imposed, like it's the case in certain countries already. But nevertheless, it's an important initiative, which I would like also to submit to your discussion. I ask again you to start.
I think it would be very helpful if we have easily understandable paper from the EMA regarding the handling, the management, and the rationale behind this management to motivate young experts from the different countries to contribute to the work here of the EMA. As discussed during our telephone conference, I'm not sure that only the local national competent authorities should be asked to recruit new experts. For example, our drug commission with 140 experts can give you some advice regarding experts, independent experts. There are some HTA organizations that, of course, have a lot of experience in assessing new drugs and in giving helpful advice. And as you know, these HTA associations have very strict policies regarding conflict of interest. Therefore, I would expand the basis for recruiting these experts. I would favor that at the EMA a committee should be established which will discuss difficult scenarios regarding handling or interpretation of conflict of interest. We have done this in Germany in our drug commission. If the chair, myself, is not able to decide what to do, I send it to a working group and they discuss this, including also experts from social science, experts from psychology. I think this is very helpful as an example and to base your decision in the near future on the decision of this working group. The next point, question 3, I don't think so. I think we are not at the beginning of the beginning, but we are in the middle of the process, and probably now we will not be able to neutralize residual conflicts of interest at the moment, but we will be able to decrease this. Now, the whistleblowers, we have learned a lot from whistleblowers in the past. I would like to remind you about the off-label marketing strategies and all these things. They came from whistleblowers. I think this was very helpful information for independent researchers in that field. On the other hand, unfortunately, as a clinician, I'm not able to tell you where these whistleblowers come from. I don't know. Question 5, simple answer, yes. I think it is not sufficient. For example, if you have identified publications where the conflicts of interest are not declared in the right way, there should be a consequence. I think the British Medical Journal now prohibits that these will publish a paper within the next 2 years. I think this is absolutely necessary to draw any consequences from deception and other things. I think this is very important. And I'm a little bit less optimistic regarding the European Sunshine Act, or as I learned today, the transfer of values, because this is an enormous bureaucratic act. The cost effectiveness ratio, I don't know at the moment. I think the transparency will improve, of course. Also, it's a voluntary declaration, but it has no consequences. And I think it's up to us from an academic, from a regulatory side to decide how to handle these conflicts of interest. I'm not very optimistic that this will help a lot the Sunshine Act in Europe in 2016 or later.
Anja?
Thank you very much. Yeah, I've already said I think it's important that you work on this with reputation and gratitude. And I think maybe it's a good idea for EMA also to work in peacetime for calling in some more certified board experts to get a bigger base of what you are. And then it's also easier to do all the paperwork because it doesn't have to be within 2 hours or something. So that there's lots of things that can be improved there. With regards to the peer review and transparency, I think that is really, really important because transparency and the knowledge that there will be transparency will, I hope so, at least will make sure that people who wanted to not declare things will stay away, basically. Because as long as we're working on things that people are declaring themselves, there is always a risk that people simply stay silent about some things. And if there's openness, then they know sooner or later I'm going to be caught in this one. And that is, I think that's really important, just to ensure it. Whistleblowers, I don't know, the breach of trust things, that's not my, I don't have much knowledge there, so I will not say anything. With the Sunshine proposal there, I'm actually happy to hear it. I think this is the right way forward. And the only way that we here in EMA and also the pharmaceutical industry can earn trust from the community is to be open about what is it we are doing. We stand behind the products that are authorized. These are our trials. These are our results. These are the decision we've taken. Come and challenge us. See if you can do it better. Because there's nothing that's black or white here. Lots of decisions are, oh yeah, but there is a weighing. And then we come forward, this is our decision. If you disagree, that's fine, but at least you have a chance to look in the cards that we had also. Thank you.
Daniel?
Well, I just wonder, I think I've seen some medical writers or people drafting expert reports for industry, at least mentioning that in their CVs. Whereas I've never seen anybody mentioning in their CV that they have been the assessor for the regulators of that. No, but it you know, why not? At the end, if we are transparent, why not? You know, so that could be maybe helpful for them. Now, I still believe that on point number 3, you probably cannot or will never be able to avoid people to hide something or to lie whatsoever. But the important point, of course, is that you might neutralize them in terms of having no longer any impact on the I would say opinion they express. And that's exactly what we have with the peer review, as mentioned. And don't forget, we have peer review at every and any step of any procedures. When you see how many people are involved in a final decision, that's a, I would say, collegial decision from a plenary body where you have so many persons involved. So I think we can neutralize their impact. You cannot neutralize their conflict of interest. That's but what matters at the end. And for the rest, I think I have nothing to add.
Okay, and as you said in your initial statement, there is a sort of filtering upstairs and downstairs, which at the higher level, people are less prone to have any conflict because they are officials of member states and so on, and down they are more in the external expertise world, and there is a filtering process in the procedure itself. Okay, Nikos?
Well, I liked what Danielle said earlier about the potential influence of any one individual opinion, which, within a setting of people who take decisions who are completely clear, I mean, that it shouldn't make any sense. The other thing that can contribute in this whole process is the transparency. And not only the transparency, which is a very, very important initiative about where money goes, but also the transparency of the data, the transparency of the clinical data. Because once all this, of course, not that they are going to be accessible on Wikipedia, but if the raw data of the clinical trials are somewhere and they can be reached from anyone, you do not need an expert who has had privileged access to this data. You may ask their opinion, but then you can make your own calculations as an agency, as an independent observer, and you can certify and verify whether what the opinion was correct or not. So I think that the transparency is going to open up the ability for the agency to consult with any of those individuals who may have been mothers and fathers, as long as all the data is made publicly available, one way or the other. So I think that, well, about the Sunshine proposal, I think it is important that FPA makes it publicly available and described, and also asks for a consultation, so that we review it and find it to our satisfaction. Otherwise, I think the regulators and the legislators should also have their plan B if we do not find it to be sufficient. So you should put it out there. You should listen to the comments of what we think is not captured. And then, of course, it will get better, and maybe it will not make any legislative attempt necessary.
Okay, thank you. Martin?
Yes. As to the first question, values are important for sure. I, however, do not think they are enough as a recognition. At the end of the day, you need to enable people to work, and just thanking them and giving them a medal won't do much for that. The second question, I don't understand it really. I'm sorry.
It's the idea that maybe since they have established a very complex procedure,
Yes.
very thorough, it may be excessively bureaucratic and could be
Yes.
simplified. But,
Indeed, well, that was my point,
Yeah.
indeed. So, yeah. The third point is very important, is this idea that collegiality could solve all problems, basically, all bias problems. It is true to a certain extent, but it certainly doesn't round the square, because first of all, collegiality doesn't solve structural problems. When you have more than half of a panel, or even a blocking minority, who is convinced that a certain ID is more important than anything else, normally this force will prevail, even if it doesn't constitute the majority. The same goes for transparency, and that's actually a way to answer the fourth question as well. Because especially since we are watchdogs ourselves, we all often get this question about whistleblowers is, yes, but this and this and this were public. Why didn't you go there? Well, sorry, we're 12. Europe is 500 million inhabitants. And in Brussels, in general, the discrepancy of lobbying force between the industry and the, say, organized civil society is 7-8 to 1. So you can be transparent. I mean, when you get punched in your face in the streets, it might be transparently under a camera, still you get hurt. That doesn't solve the problem. The idea of the name and shame, well, it's a very... Yeah, in principle, I would say yes, but it's a very drastic measure to publicly name and shame an individual. You shouldn't do that lightly at all. And well, you won't be surprised to hear that I'm highly skeptical, but open to experience about the EFP sunshine, since voluntary schemes typically are designed to detail legislation. I've never seen anything voluntary come from the industry actually fulfill what it was advertised it would do. But I'm still open.
On the naming and shaming, was it not your organization who has listed the 10 worst offenders of the revolving door?
Yes, and we keep doing that.
So it's still something which can be done if in
It
extreme
can be done, and what I want to say is that it's a desperate measure. It's the tool that only a weak can use against the mighty, and we would be much happier to be able to do something else. Basically, we would be much happier if agencies and in general public institutions could take care of themselves first. And whistleblowers, that's the worst case scenario, really.
Okay. Richard, you had already your say, but maybe you wanted just to add.
Yeah, certainly stimulated by the comments. I'm very happy that Martin gives the industry the benefit of the doubt in delivering on this. In fact, you don't see these days doctors on golf courses with their sales representatives. You don't see doctors on cruise ships in the Mediterranean paid by the pharmaceutical industry. That's all cleaned up by ourselves. Okay, so we've done it in the past.
So they don't have a green or yellow badge on the golf course.
No, they're not allowed to go. So we've shown in the past we're not always that quick in responding to what we need to do, but we are finally getting it, I think. Now, I wanted to comment on what Nico said about this whole combination of data and document transparency, both through the new AMA policy, which is going to come or be implemented, and the industry commitments. The combination of this is going to change the landscape. Plus then this database of ours, which, by the way, as is decided, we're going to do it. Now we're consulting about how to do it, so all the comments are welcome. But this discussion also reminds me of some this whole notion of experts. I think it was alluded to in your introductory statements, Fernand, that because of the way this is written in the legislation. I remember when Sweden joined the European Union, I was working for the Swedish regulatory agency, and when we were preparing. And I remember how when we had to familiarize with this, with those experts to the EMA. And my boss then, Kjell Strandberg, he said, when we read this text, we said, well, this is so tough. We can only submit our own employees. So he took basically the mailing list of the agency and submitted to this database. Whereas the French had a database of, 549 experts or something, which was submitted. So, and I think that was the beginning of some of the problems we've had, some of the confusion we've had. It's because there is such a legalistic understanding of expert that we now need to be very clear on that in the strictly following the law. Yes, you have to follow the law. And these other people you want to talk to, you have to call them something else. You have to call them expert witnesses. I think they need to be increasingly showing up at the agency to give input, but they're not experts in the strictest sense, and they're definitely not part of decision making. I think, again, everyone's violently agreeing that an increased use of expert witnesses, but then they are labeled as that and not as experts according to the European legislation. The other comment I'd like to make is that maybe there is a role here for strengthening the role of scientific societies in nominating experts. It's been triggered by colleagues from Germany that even if member states are the ones supposed to nominate experts, still many of these scientific societies have done very good work on improving governance over the last few years. I met with representatives from ESMO, the European Society of Medical Oncology, and they have on their website so far members only, password protected, but they have for all their 8,000 members conflicts of interest disclosures. Because they've said when people go to a conference, you can't see the fine print on all the slides, and you may listen to someone in the corridor. You're not going to go around with a big sign, conflict of ahead of going to this meeting, or when you read a journal, you have on the web everything people have been involved in. So I think this should be commended and it should be stimulated. And I just wonder if you could consider with the Commission whether there's a role for those medical associations that have taken steps to have well-working conflicts of interest. I think European Society of Cardiology also does this. When you write guidelines and very clear procedures on who you involve, maybe you can capitalize on that, and maybe even then also with these associations get the accreditation or the recognition. So I'll just leave that on the table for consideration.
Rory?
Thank you, Fernand. Very briefly, there's just 2 quick points. On point number 2, this idea of expanding the expert list, I totally agree. You can't just maybe rely on nominating bodies and national competent authorities. But again, I'll just repeat a point I made before. It was said that maybe specialist organizations and young researchers, whatever, okay, should, at an early stage in their career, be encouraged to get on the expert list so that they could be used. But just bear in mind, if somebody comes to me as a head of unit in a university and says, Rory, I want to put my name down, and what this might mean is I can't take part in collaborative research with industry, I'm not going to write research grant proposals, then I'm going to tell them, your job's in the university. I need you to do this. I can't allow you to take on this role if it's going to preclude you from doing basic university research work. So again, please don't choke off the academic route by making it whiter than white. And just the second point is point number 3. I can't agree more with Daniel on this point as well. The idea, I've sat on committees for many, many years, and we talk about a peer review system and peer reviewers, but the entire scientific committee acts as a peer review. If you've got a biased opinion, which is in any way not evidence-based, many people come up with an opinion, and other members of the committee challenge them, where is the evidence base for that opinion? And if they don't have it, they're very quickly pushed to the side. And it's only when you can actually justify and back up this so-called strange opinion that people begin to listen to it. So I am not convinced that in reality that scientific committees within the agency don't produce robust decisions, because the committee and transparency actually will weed out problems where there's no evidence base to it. Thank you.
Thank you. Pierre?
Yes, to enhance the robustness of the decisions within the agency, we need to have access to the raw data to allow other people in the Cochrane collaborations or some other people to rework on the data. That's an essential part of transparency and robustness of decision. On point 3, yes, I think that peer review and transparency can help neutralize residual conflict of interest, because the question with conflict of interest is that when you have different interests, the question is for whom are we working and to whom are we accountable? And that's not so simple. As a researcher, am I working for myself, my career? Am I working for science, for the industry, for the agency? I don't know. It's not an easy answer. So to help resolve this problem, transparency may help to feel accountable when you are working to the agency. You need to feel accountable to the public, to the patient safety, to public health. And here transparency means to easily can check the opinions, I mean, what people are saying and their declaration of interest, and also to be able to help the discussion going on, because it's not so easy to be divergent in a discussion. Some people are too shy, some are too polite, or they feel too bored, too tired at the end of the day. To help them to feel still accountable to the public interest, the verbatim or the video, like it is used in the US or in France, really it changed the behavior of people, and it helped people having a divergent opinion to express it, because they know that this will be made publicly available. About transparency, name and shame also is a tool to help people feeling accountable to the public interest. Having the conflict of interest on the web, yes, but where in the web? If it is in 1,000 different places, it feels like it's not workable. The Sunshine Act in US, it's workable because you can find in one place all the links for one particular person or institution. In France, it's not workable. And I hope that in Europe, you we will have a workable Sunshine, which means that with a common search engine, we will find in a click all the links of one particular person. And I'm not sure EFPA is willing to have this Sunshine, so I'm asking you, are you really working for this workable Sunshine?
The idea, we are consulting with medical associations about how to make that happen, because in the perfect world, it will be medical associations in the countries, for instance, that would have a portal into which we would report every year all the data, rather than having to go through all the websites. But right now, we're only we're collecting. We've decided how we should collect it, and now we are consulting widely with medical associations and civil society about how to make that disclosure work. So that's the ambition.
Good.
That's the ambition.
Serge?
I would like to come back to the expert list a little bit. As member of the SAG and lately as chairman, sometimes I've been deeply shocked by the situation we met. For instance, at a few meetings, there were more experts coming with the companies that seated beside us at the SAG. And this clearly is a challenging issue. So what can we do, again, to make that important leaders would be prone to cooperate and provide us insight instead of coming with companies? I understand that for some of the experts, the big money is the issue, but I think that could be managed, that at least some major leader of opinion in the field concerned by the meeting could be invited. And again, I'm very happy of this concept of expert witness. And I agree that the term of expert should not be used on this situation. But an expert witness, we should elaborate this concept a little bit further, provide maybe more safeguards about this use. Regarding the Sunshine proposal, I a little bit disagree with my neighbor. In France, at least, the government has issued a law which made mandatory to industry to publish any conflict of interest, any payment from the single and first euro. But I agree that it should be made available such a way that it would be very easy to cross with the data and the database, for instance, of the EMEA. If you can cross-examine the published interest, for instance, in France, and the list of experts and the declaration of interest of experts coming from France, it would be very easy to check if the declaration is true or not. And I think this could be very easily applied. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Besides all the specific remarks, there are many remarks which have to do with combining in a better way what exists, but transparency and this question, because they are complementary. And anyway, it's the intention of the agency to publish a sort of brochure which will try to bring part of it together. But I'm quite sure that not doing much more, but doing it in a more transparent way will create more trust. As I said at the beginning, it's difficult to find one's way. It's normal because now it becomes a central issue and maybe something can be done about it. And I would advise also that in that brochure or on the web, beside the procedure and so on, people should be able to tell the story. I mean, make it an interesting story. It's not because the agency is forced into becoming transparent. It is because it wants to be transparent and neutralize the conflict of interest. So I think it's important because people will otherwise only go and see it when there is a scandal. And when you have more than 3,000 experts, one day you will have a scandal. So it's better to tell the story before the scandal happens than try to be defensive. At this stage, I would like to address two important components, but I will start maybe with the head of agencies chair, because this is an important part, sometimes invisible, of the European Medicines Agency, but of the European Medicines Authorization System in general. And I had listed these 4 questions, and maybe you could give us sort of your first view, and other members of national authorities could also react later on in the general discussion. So.
Thank you very much. I would appreciate that very much if some of my colleagues can also give some comments. My name is Achilles Kalis. For those who do not know me, I'm the head of the Dutch Medicines Evaluation Board, a member of the Management Board. That's why I'm seated here on this side of the table. And also, as Fernand pointed out, the chair of the heads of medicines agencies, which is an informal group of national competent authorities, the heads of national competent authorities, who will meet about 4 times a year to discuss all kind of issues, for example, conflicts of interest and how to handle them. And I will be coming back to that later, because I have a very urgent feeling of having heard all the discussions in the last hours, to also point out something else, and that is that according to a commission evaluation of the EMA, only being done 3 years ago in 2010 by a company called Ernst & Young, one of the conclusions of that report was that we have a network in the EU which is very competent, very effective, with predictable outcomes, and is able to get into contact and to use expertise throughout the EU on a very high level. So if you read that report, which also has some critical issues, because it is not only sunshine and Hosanna in that report on the network, but if you look at that report and you see the main conclusions of it, you think that maybe we are now addressing a problem which I don't say it will not exist, but which is a little bit over-exaggerated in the way that it is coming into the public domain time and time again and again. So having said that, I would also like to point out that in the environment in which we live at the moment, and I think others have also addressed that sometimes, we are living in an environment in which my government, certainly, but I know for a lot of other governments in the EU and the European Commission itself, are heading what they say towards a knowledge-based community in which we need to have addressed a Europe that is knowledgeable, finding of a high expertise, etc. And on another level in the EU, but also in the Netherlands, you can see that there is a very big stimulus of public-private initiatives, people working together, exchanging knowledge. And I think that one of the issues, for example, in the transparency discussion that we also have parallel to this conflict of interest discussion, we can see there is a huge stimulus of having available data on which decisions are being made.
so that not only the regulators can make their decisions, but they make transparent on which data they have based their decisions, publish that, might it be in minutes of meetings or in assessment reports. And also there, I think that we have made huge steps in the last couple of years. So I would like to underline that, to my opinion, and we have looked into that also, I'm not very much aware of big mistakes, big wrong decisions being made in the last 10 to 20 years or whatever that the EMA exists. If you re-evaluate all the decisions that have been made by the CHMP and other scientific committees, if you look on which data at that present time decisions have been made. So also there, from a public health point of view, I think that we have a system that is functioning very well. And I can tell you that with other friends of mine, or other colleagues of mine, we are also engaging in a global discussion with heads of the FDA, Chinese FDA, Japan, or all around the world. And there also we get reflected that the system that we have in Europe at the moment is sometimes in certain regions looked upon with envy. So having said that, I would like to underline again that I think that we need also constantly work on improvement, both on the fact that how we use expertise, the transparency in that, and the fact that we need experts that might have also a conflict of interest. But if everybody knows what kind of a conflict of interest we have there, you can also value and weigh the way that they bring in their expertise and say, yes, of course, we have heard you, but nevertheless, we are from a different opinion, or no, this sounds very reasonable, and that is why we use that expert opinion in the decision making that we have, and which is the, let's say, exclusive right of the regulator itself. On conflicts of interest, there's also something what I call, we have the obvious ones. For example, I used to be a medical director of a pharmaceutical firm up until 96, 97. And although that is more than, how much is it? It's 16 years ago now. I'm not legally binding to have that in my conflict of interest declaration, but if you look it up on the website of EMA, I'm sure that it is always there. Because I think that everybody should know, and as a matter of fact, I think that I'm not unbiased if I'm talking about that firm, even if that firm doesn't exist anymore, which it doesn't. But nevertheless, I had a challenging time there during a couple of years, and in my case, it was a positive time. So I might be over positive of that firm. But I know a lot of people who did not have any positive issue in the firms that they work, so they might have another conflict of interest, and they might be overcritical to this firm, even maybe a little bit going further and being more negative to the firm than the firm deserves. And that is then one of the obvious ones, because as I said, I put it on my conflict of interest declaration. But I think, and I know some people, certainly also in the Netherlands, that have been involved in the industry where a grant was not assigned to them, and nobody knows that. And nobody will notice it because they won't put it in their conflict of interest issue. But again, there, I think, they are more or less biased in the way that either that firm was evaluating their issue, but also maybe the industry as a whole. So I have another issue here, and that is that if we keep on distrusting more and more people in the system, and not only distrusting them, as Anne Glover told, because what her the way that she's experiencing coming to the Commission and being a suspect on forehand instead of being openly valued, I have exactly that same feeling. And I must say, I can't say that that is not based on something, because that is, of course, the flip side of the coin. We all know very many issues that went not wrong within our industry, and in the pharmaceutical industry both, but also in on the regulator side. But as on the other hand, it has been known at the moment. So having said all that, I would just like to say something else, because that was also implemented here, and I almost felt like being a suspect again. I am working for a agency that is 100% fee-based, and I can tell you that in my agency money is not an issue, at least not with the experts, and certainly not at the Medicines Evaluation Board, so the board members. The board members are, if you would interview them, I don't even think that they would know the height of the fees that we charge to the industry. They are completely value-free, money value-free, when they are making their decisions. And I would very much like to have that publicly stated here, because again, I have the feeling that again and again it is being connected, the fee system, to the integrity of the people that are working in my agency, and I am getting very angry about that. And that is the same thing here for the EMA, I can assure you, because as a member of the management board also there, I can say that we are working with people that are purely integral. So that is one thing, and on the other hand, it is a public service. So if I want my driver's license in the Netherlands, I have to pay for that, and if I want to have a marketing authorization for a drug, I also have to pay for it. And I don't think that there's anything wrong about that. As a matter of fact, I'm a public servant, and I want to be a public servant working in a public service, and I will do anything to keep that integrity in my agency. And that is another question here on the thing, in the what are the initiatives of the heads of medicines agencies in Europe on this. Now, it's very difficult to talk about for what is now 28 member states and 3 of the EEA, so it's 31 states. But what I can see is that the system also here is very much working. And EMA is setting an example, being sure that everybody working for EMA is holding to those conflict of interest regulation, and that means that I, in my agency, for example, but I'm sure it's also the same in Italy and some and all the other agencies, I can't have a weight with 2 measures. I can't say to my experts, I'm having a little bit less of implementation of a conflict of interest if you're working for me, but if you're going to the EU, then I only have the highest level. So this discussion, together with Guido, Noël Wattion and others, is on a regular basis on the agenda of the heads of agencies. We all know what we are doing. A lot of the heads are also a member of the management board, which might be a conflict of interest, you must say, but we have a network, and there we are all aware of the fact that we are working in a network, and that if something goes wrong in member state A, it will reflect on member state C, so we are keeping each other sharp in that. Did I miss something, Fernand? I don't think so. Similar conflict of interest, yes, of course. What conflict? I told EMA contracts expertise at the cost assembly. Should there be a contractual conflict of interest guarantee? Well, we have it. Everybody is underlining the conflict of interest declarations, as far as I know. Or didn't you meant that?
Well, to make it more concrete, we've heard that another way of attracting experts from academia and so on is declaration of interest, the call for interest. And of course, the agency does it in specific cases, but it cannot do it generally because most of the experts have to be nominated by the member states. So wouldn't there be a practical solution, not so easy to start with, but a practical solution that in the future there are sort of joint call for interest, which would be issued by national agencies and the European agency, which would state the conditions for conflict of interest, but also the rewards and for the working hours, who covers it. I mean, I don't have to say who does it, but if there was a joint exercise, because it's the same pool, or it is at least partly the same pool, why not do it together with the same principles, even if the legislative background is different? So it could be a concrete step to attract more experts, but on the same basis and a very transparent one. But that's just an idea from what I heard around the table. I will give the floor.
The last question, Fernand, is
Yeah.
I'm very easy in that. I think that somebody breaching trust in any way is not able to work for the network in any way, not on a national level and not on an EU level. And somebody else said you could publish it, and to my mind, it can be published also.
In certain countries, if you fill an official declaration of interest and you cheat, it could be a criminal offense as well. And that, I mean, it's rarely used, but it's a deterrent, because the naming and shaming is probably a good idea, but there should be also sometimes sanctions behind it. It's just a question. And it would be good to know where this occurs. Pat would like to complete the picture, and he had prepared also questions, so I give him the floor, and then
thank you, Fernand. Pat O'Mahony from the Irish Medicines Board, and like Aguinis, a member of the management board here and chair for a few years also. Just a couple of comments. I'll try and keep off topics that have been covered already. First of all, I'd like to compliment the agency on organising the event, and I think for those of us whose day-to-day work is sitting as regulators with our colleagues, it's nice to have the full spectrum of opinions, and that's been very refreshing today, and I welcome that, and I welcome hearing all of the views that have been expressed, and they're all very valuable to us. Our job, and Aguinis has said it, is we're public health people. We look after public health. And I must say that my personal perspective stems from saying this, that without industry, we don't have medicines to treat our patients. Therefore, this question is it a necessary evil? And that's not the term that I would use. Industry is part of the picture here. Industry do the research, industry make the products. So that's the landscape in which we're operating. But as in any sector where value is built and profits are made, there can be different levels and different standards across the industry. So what's required is a good, solid, robust regulatory framework, and that needs to be defended. And that's where I think we all are coming from. I wanted to make a point that I captured in the note I sent to you. I responded to Anya's comments around the use of language, and we're using the word conflict of interest, and we're using the word risk in how we rate people. And I welcomed her raising that, because I think we should move away from that language completely. It's incredibly negative when I talk to people and persuade them to join my board at home or come to Europe to do some work. I think we should just be talking about declared interests, and we should have a zero level for sure, where people have a zero level and they can aspire to that. But another interesting thing, I think, prompted by hearing different points of view today, is that we tend to be inward looking sometimes and think that we just need to reflect on our interests and our conflicts, supposedly having worked in the industry or not, and so on and so on. Everybody around this room has interests. Everybody has interests in this topic. And I think sometimes that point is not covered adequately. I think so. I'll concentrate in these comments on politicians or patient groups or any of the NGOs. They all have interests. They are activists, or they're full staff members, or they're on a salary, or they're building a career, or they're building status, or they're doing publications, or whatever they're doing. If we're being honest about this, everybody commenting in any shape or form on medicines and medicines regulation has an interest. And I think that's an important point I'd love to see teased out by some colleagues. Finally, Chairman, just to respond to your slide, and Aginas has commented, I'd make just 2 additional comments. First of all, 77 million looks to be a big figure. It's less than 8% of the budgets of the national competent authorities combined. So lest people around the table who are not aware of that think that it's a major part of our income. It's not. It's less than 8%. Having said that, we work as a network, and all of the NCAs and the EMA are part of a network. And therefore, your questions around sanctioning people and dealing with breach of trust and so on, in the context where many of the experts, committee members and so on, are nominated by the national competent authorities, in fact, we can deal very well with that at the national level. We have various levels of sanction, but the ultimate one is we withdraw their nomination. So actually, the national authorities have a major role to play in how we respond to this challenge. Thank you.
May I give you the floor also from this perspective, the management?
My name is Rannveig Gunnarsdóttir. I come from I'm head of the Icelandic Medicines Agency since the year 2000. And coming from a small community, we face the problems or challenge of hiring experts. I don't think any of our experts are without conflict of interest. And then, I mean, not actively, maybe in their previous profession, but also many of them are working partly for the agency and have another job as a university lecturer or a hospital clinician. And they work for an institution that accepts money from the industry, not in their field. They might not even be aware of it, but they are working there. So their institution makes them indirectly with a conflict of interest. And they really are very unhappy of being then regarded as having a grade 2 or 3 or whatever. But it's very difficult to hire these, to get experts if you have this mistrust. And as we have discussed here earlier, it's radioactivity. And by law in Iceland, you are supposed to, you have to sign and it's legally binding that you cannot have any interest in industry or financially in Iceland. So that is by law. So if somebody has that when he is employed at our agency, then he could be criminally, yeah. So it's a difficult situation. So I think the talk about trust, we need trust, and I think transparency is the only solution for trust, complete as much as possible as we can. So publishing clinical trials, results of clinical trials, or publishing these things, that I think that would be very important, important step in losing or diminishing the distrust of everybody.
Thank you. I'd like to turn now to the Commission and the agencies, the European agencies who are there. We had already the more detailed question about patient we have put aside, but what is interesting is from the experience of the Commission itself and the overview the Commission has on all the other scientific-based agency, what advice in a nutshell could you give to the European Medicines Agency with the current dilemma they are facing in adjusting their policy? And then I will give the floor also to ECDC and EFSA for a short reaction on that. Is there any other European agency? ECDC and EFSA? No. Okay. Commission.
Right. Thank you, Fernand. I will start by providing you with a wider picture in the Commission in view of the agency's landscape. And then I will pass the floor on to Bob, who will address more specifically the agencies within the realm of competence that you just mentioned, notably scientific-based and more particularly EFSA, EMEA, and ECDC, and probably also CPVO. You may be aware of the fact that very recently, a year and a half ago, the Commission, after quite a few years actually, if I recall correctly, 8 years of negotiations, we got to conclude a common approach with the European Parliament and the Council on EU decentralized agencies. Of course, this is much wider than just the remit of one agency, concerns 33 agencies, potentially more agencies that had been created, you know, this very well on an ad hoc basis, so as to address issues of governance, structure, functioning, independence, efficiency, seat, agreements, and the like. One of the issues that the Commission committed to address as part of its common approach was precisely the issue of conflict of interest. But again, covering this very wide array or panoply of entities, the 33 EU decentralized agencies, which are mushrooming. We had about 20 less than 10 years ago, and we had about 15 created in the last 10 years. So the problem is particularly acute for the Commission. What the Commission doesn't intend to do, to respond to your question, is actually encroach on the responsibility of those agencies to deal themselves with the issue of conflict of interest. The agencies are all independent legal entities, as you very well know, and it's really not the ambit of intention of the Commission to tell the agencies what they have to do in terms of dealing with that conflict of interest issue. However, the Commission has committed in consultation with the agencies to draw up guidelines that can be used by the agencies in order to draw up a prevention and management policy for conflict of interest. And this is what the Commission is currently doing. But those guidelines will have to apply to very different animals in terms of agencies. We have regulatory agencies in terms of decision-making agencies. We have agencies that directly feed in the decision-making process at the Commission, scientific-based agencies. We have observatories, monitoring center, inspection-based agencies, and all those agencies have very different degree of exposure to conflict of interest, also degree of exposure to the industry or other such stakeholders. So we have to devise guidelines that are both useful and applicable to all those different situations. Therefore, the guidelines will very probably promote the idea, well, will very probably set out risk factors that the agency need to take into consideration when analyzing their own specific exposure to conflict of interest. And then once this has been decided, decide on the risk level according also to other things that we have discussed, the role of the expert in the agency, the responsibility of the agency itself, the collegial or not collegial decision-making of the agency, and so forth. I think I will stop here. I'm available for questions afterwards. Of course, there is a whole different word, which is the expert groups of the Commission, which was touched upon by Martin just before, but I think that would take us a little bit outside the framework of our discussion here. So if we have the time, I'm happy to discuss that as well. And okay, thank you, Fernand. Just before I answer your question, I would like to take the freedom to respond to a comment made by Martin, where he said, yeah, He said, okay, there is the collegial work, but at the end of the day, the experts can be overruled by the majority. I think one should also consider the possibility of a minority opinion. So it can be that 99% of the experts are of one opinion. If somebody, for one or another reason, be it, I would not say an intellectual conflict of interest, but we have also different academic schools, is of a different opinion, this person can express a minority opinion. And I can tell you that the Commission is taking minority opinions seriously. And we really would consider, not reflect twice, but 3 times before embarking without considering this conflict or this divergent minority opinion. I also have to make a declaration of interest, because otherwise I wouldn't have been here. And the reason why is also, since 3 years, I'm chairing a task force on declarations of interest and potential conflicts of interest. We do that as partner DG to various agencies. We did also together with the SecGen, which is always invited. Also, the internal audit services of the Commission are invited, and of course, the agencies are present. What are we covering? We are covering Sanco's 3 non-food scientific committees, EFSA, EMA, ECDC, and CPVO. It's clear that we try to develop common standards as a parent DG, but by doing so, we also have to take into account the particularities of each individual agency. It's clear for the CPVO, for those who don't know, it's a plant variety agency in Angers, which has around 46 staff members, that they cannot apply the same rules as we ask for the 3 other agencies. We learned from the past, what Fernand said, okay, in the past we discovered that somebody was on the black payment list of the tobacco industry. Now what we do is to scrutinize them and to consult Dr. Google to see if somebody has not omitted to declare anything. We look not only at the experts, we look at the management board, and this is more in particular for EFSA because there the management board is not, they are not representatives of the member states, but they are candidates applying ad personam. In doing so, we ask them to fill in a very strict declaration of interest, which we scrutinized against their CV and see if they might have overlooked something. Then we write back by lettre recommandée to ask for clarifications. And even when we have shortlisted them, we again Google them all to see if we can, if there is anything that needs to be addressed. The purpose of this task force, which meets 2 times a year, and we do it since 3 years, was not to see which are the best agency or the worst one, but in a collegial way to share experiences and to see where is there still a room of improvement, whilst ensuring that we have the necessary scientific experience. We also considered benchmarking against other international bodies, and I would not be afraid to, let's say, to explain the comparison. I invite other international bodies to take over what has been done in the agencies, EMA, ECDC, and EFSA. And of course, there will always be room of improvement. I think we should also look not only to say, okay, we have a policy of declarations of interest, but also see what is the result. And I think if we want to create trust with the citizens is to show, okay, we had so many cases, so many scientists involved, we did so many investigations, and okay, we found, as we showed this morning, so many cases where there was a problem, and these mitigating measures were taken. We do have to rely on individual declarations, on honesty. We cannot ask for a police inquiry or torture people to see if they've told the honesty. We're living in Europe, we're not living in utopia. We can do only our utmost. And there will always be breaches of trust, which are, of course, giving or getting a lot of publicity, much more than the positive work that has been done. And I do agree with the attitude of name and shame, but sometimes we need to be careful that we can be confronted with very honest scientists who really are, who don't have any conflict of interest, but they might have overlooked that they have been present at a conference which was financed by industry. And I think there we need to put it in the right perspective. I do agree if it was an intentional action not to declare an interest, real interest, then name and shame, let's do it. But I think besides this name and shame, if you want to create trust or to improve the trust, is also to trace back and to see to what extent that particular expert has been involved in the framing of the final scientific assessment. Has this person intervened, and to what extent? And that, I think, is much more important than just to say, okay, we name and we blame, but to see where eventually has the scientific opinion to be reviewed. I must say that I think it's a very interesting initiative today, and I learned certain things, but I'm glad to tell you that most of the things we discussed it already in our task force. So, but it confirms that we have not overlooked that many things, and for the new things, we take them on board to see where there are still, where is still a room for improvement.
Okay, thank you. May I just ask ECDC and EFSA to give a short statement about how to encourage the European Medicines Agency on that path?
Thank you, Chair. I'm Johan Giesecke. I'm Chief Scientist at the European Centre for Disease Prevention and Control in Stockholm. I want to thank, and I will start, and then Rebecca Trott, our legal counsel, will continue a few small comments. I want to thank EMA for this initiative. It's been very useful for us because we realize that we all share similar problems, more or less, and we also, in complement to what Robert mentioned about the legal aspects of conflict of interest, in the network of European agencies, we have a small sub-network created this year of the agencies that do give scientific advice. There are about 10 of them, looking also at the conflict of interest issue from a more technical and practical point of view. I would say for ECDC it's a little less of a problem than for EMA and maybe for EFSA as well. We're not so much touched by being at the front end dealing with industry. There are a few examples. Vaccines is an area where we're working. Diagnostics is something that should not be forgotten and that's sometimes overlooked in these discussions. I would also say, someone else mentioned it, that the professional conflict of interest, we have discussed that quite a lot, and that's more difficult. I can ask you, how many shares do you have in a pharmaceutical company? But I cannot ask you, why do you have this personal animosity with the professor because he doesn't like your research? That's much more difficult and almost as important, I would say. The jealousy, the scientific jealousy, and that my scientific career is built, not mine, but someone's academic career is built on this research, which is very important, regardless of the money. I will end one example, actually, how the network and the peer structure works quite well. When ECDC was young, we were only 8 years old, but when we were even younger, our advisory forum, which is our scientific board, pointed out in one instance that we had been using a person who had a conflict of interest that we had overlooked. But the 30 peers in our advisory forum said, you use an expert here that you should not have used. And that shows how this system actually does work when you have some peer. I will hand over to you, Rebecca.
Thank you. Also, I want to echo the thanks that have been given both by Johan and by our Sanko colleagues. This kind of conference, this kind of stakeholder meeting is so interesting to attend because we hear far more feedback from all areas of relevant stakeholders, and I think it makes the job of this very tricky area of conflicts of interest far easier to address. ECDC, to be fair, comes rather late to this party. Our colleagues at EFSA and EMA were rather quicker in producing their policies, and on the basis of some very useful feedback we've had from them, we had our own stakeholder consultation last year, and on the basis of that and the feedback we received not only from the other agencies but also from the task force referred to by Bob van Hoorde, we produced our own policy and implementing regulations in November last year. So first of all, I think that this kind of initiative should be very much supportive. I think the more that we discuss these issues, the more we understand and the more chances there are to actually come to some solutions to some fairly thorny problems. I don't think there's a quick fix. It's something that we've been looking at for a long time, and a lot of people have been thinking about how to resolve the issues. I think one of the strengths of this group in particular is that there are many clinical statisticians here, and because it's a relatively new field, I agree with colleagues here who have said, especially our colleague from the veterinary sector, who says, why do we choose 5 years? Why not 3 years? I think we need to look at this evidence-based medicine, and I think it's useful to collaborate and to bring in statistics to make sure that the any barriers that we place, any requirements that we place are based on fact. Why do we think that 5 years is reasonable, but 5 years, 1 month, suddenly one becomes white? There are shades of grey. Perhaps not a useful reference. However, moving on swiftly, and those of you who laughed can draw your own conclusions. However, moving on, the change of attitude. I was really quite touched by the comments of Anne Glover and also of your Dutch Management Board member. The experts who do contribute, it appears, and I'm not an expert in the medical field, don't do it for the money. They don't do it for the glory. And what I understand from colleagues in this centre is that we often ask them at the most inconvenient times to provide advice on something, often on a Friday evening, and they receive no financial benefit from us, very rarely. We ask them and they genuinely are willing to give an opinion. And so I think it's very important that we have a change of opinion. The colleague from the Management Board here said, we don't want the terminology of conflicts of interest. We don't want to be an assumption that we are guilty
could
until
we just
proven. Yes.
shorten a bit, because we still
course.
have to hear the EFSA and we have to give the floor to the other stakeholders.
Of course. So what I agree with is this point about we should most certainly look at declaring interests. I think from our perspective, for us to have experts without interests would be very, very difficult. But I believe that transparency is the way forward. However, I put a note of caution with that, because as a lawyer, of course, I look at the Regulation 1049 in comparison, which is the transparency regulation, but also the data protection rights of the individuals. So I think this is an area that we need to look at some balance. And I think it's a fascinating topic. I think we could talk for a lot longer, but I'll leave it here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. EFSA, please.
Thank you, Chair. My name is Dirk Detken. I'm the head of the legal department of the European Food Safety Authority. My conflict of interest is here that my department is in charge of drafting the rules on independence of EFSA, so I would potentially not have a very negative spin on them. The EFSA and the EMAS situation, the governance is extremely similar, but of course it has essential dissimilars. For example, in EFSA, we appoint our experts by the EFSA, so the member states are not involved in that. That also gives, of course, the EFSA a slightly different spin in managing the conflict of interest situation of the experts. But I'm going to be extremely brief in view of the fact that the meeting has ended officially 2 minutes ago. So I would just highlight to you a few features of the way how we've been working on that one, and some paths in which we think in the future we might explore them. We've been working on DOI rules also since 2006. We also had several reviews of our independence rules, and the most relevant one was in 2011 when we actually developed our policy on independence together with our stakeholders. We had events with 140 stakeholders commenting our policy, and what we try to do in that policy is to acknowledge, why are we doing this exercise? We're not doing this exercise in order to have a clean expert sitting in the panel. We're doing this exercise to generate the trust in the decision-making process. And if you look at the decision-making process, and that was highlighted already today by the chair and especially also by Mr. Brasseur several times, is of course about how are the decisions done and how independent is actually the corporate output of the European Food Safety Authority. It's not about just cleaning up one expert and then then focusing your whole conflict of interest system with regard to the individuals. No, it's about making the decision-making process independent. And that was a bit the spin that we took. So in our policy on independence, we actually did not only focus on the COI, conflict of interest declaration of an individual, but we looked at all the different decision-making steps we have in-house in order to identify where actually could be there threats to the independence of EFSA. And the DOI pillar is actually just one pillar of the independence approach of EFSA. I think that's an approach which is hugely interesting, and in the collegial decision-making, which was already highlighted, our commission colleague was highlighting the minority opinions which exist, the way that the methodology in which risk assessment is done is actually set out in the foods area. I mean, it's written. So, I mean, the working bases of our experts are transparently available. In the fact that we have audit systems, in case we have overlooked a conflict of interest situation with one experts, we do indeed look into the outcome. We see what was the impact of the person in the decision of that specific outcome. We have opened up our panels. We have certain panel sessions which are open to the public. People can come in, whatever their interests are. So the whole spin of that policy was more about the corporate independence of EFSA. Now, have we succeeded in convincing our critical stakeholders by that? I don't think so. The discussion is still mainly about the individual independence of experts. But I think it is important, and it is a path which perhaps we want to pursue, to take knowledge of the fact that we have indeed 21 experts, at least in the EFSA panels, expert communities. We have 21 experts which are developing together in a collegial manner the outputs. And potentially, I'm not saying that this is the case how we handle it in EFSA, but potentially if one of them would have a conflict of interest, what would actually be the impact on the output of EFSA? I think these are interesting reflections for the future. Just to highlight a few aspects. Yeah.
Please, we have 5 minutes to go, and I would like still to ask from stakeholders their opinion.
I give you something
Could
on
you
the
just shorten
attractiveness. How is EFSA trying to make the experts being interested in working for EFSA? Now, of course, we have exactly the same starting situation as the EMEA has. We have developed, indeed, some training scheme. We're implementing a training scheme where our experts can benefit from some training when they work for us. We have developed an EFSA journal in which actually it is possible for the experts to publish work they have done in the context of EFSA. We have also involved, you mentioned that, Fernand, we have also a sophisticated documentation we provide them where we express our thanks after they have left the panels. These are details, but we tried also to grab these little issues. What we also do, we invest a lot of time in case they are under threat because of their independence. We invest a lot of time in defending our experts. And I think there I come to my last point, if you allow. You were asking about whistleblowers. In EFSA, the declaration of interest are made public since 2003. It is in our final regulation, so they have always been in the public. And therefore, the whistleblowing in the sense at EFSA, I would say it works. We have NGOs who pick up certain constellations. They come to us, and sometimes in a, for the experts, of course, not very nice way, they, and then because it can go public, are concretely attacking, let's say, challenging the independence of very concrete experts. So whistleblowing is in place. It is happening. Last comment on the breach of trust. We are operating a breach of trust procedure since 2007, 2008. And again, as it was already indicated by the Commission, a very important point there is that the majority of the mistakes that do happen with regard to conflicts of with declaration of interest, the majority of the non-complete declaration of interest are based on misunderstandings because, as you all said, the rules are extremely complex. So managing a breach of trust procedure also requires a phased approach. So we have a differentiation between the breach of the rules and the breach of trust, which I find is a very important feature. So I
thank you very much. I have to wrap up at the end and just give the floor to Guido. But I have easy questions, which I try to handle immediately. One from Alistair Kent, who was at the very beginning member of the Orphan Drugs Committee representing patients. And this is a basic question. Is there any evidence of a case where an undisclosed conflict of interest has compromised the integrity of a regulatory decision? I asked the question before. The answer is no. We don't have a case.
Well, I can say we had the opportunity to review many of the processes last year when we have been denied the discharge. We have been asked to review many processes, and we could very proudly say that we're not influential at all. So a single expert we can say that single expert is never influential for the final decision.
And in the breach of procedure, if there was a case, the decision concerned would have to be revised also. Huh?
Well, in case of a breach of procedure, and we initiated the first step of the breach of procedure last year in more than 30 cases, following an ex post control primarily, and one case as part of a whistleblower. The next step of the breach of procedure had not to be followed because we could clarify with the experts concerned.
Okay. And this is important to say because I didn't mean that you should put their names if it was, I mean, they have to have the right to explain, and if it was intentional, that's where the sanction is. I would like to bring together two questions from Albert van der Zijden, as well as from Victoria English, about the industry confidentiality agreements. I'll leave all the text with you because they are more specific. But so the question is, if an expert is bound by a confidentiality agreement at the time of being reviewed in an expert role, should this be included in the paper? I leave it with you for consideration. And we have several comments which are rather specific and detailed, which can be handed over to the Secretariat without further ado. But I would like to give the floor to a last question, because from the Finnish agency, Pekka Koki, who wanted to comment on 2 points.
He's gone.
He's gone, okay. So you ask him next time. Okay, at this stage, I will hand over the 4 last detailed questions I have to the Secretariat, but also encourage everybody, having heard now the discussion, who want to make any concrete suggestion or even proposal to amend or improve the text as it stands, to send it directly to Noël Watillon, and you will give the address. Thank you very much.